hello guys. I'm going to talk about the Brazil coup of '64, which was one of the many clandestine operations that happened during the Cold War. And it was basically a classic coup d'etat where the Brazilian military overthrew the president João Goulart, who was accused of being communist, even though he actually wasn't. And it was just a classic coup d'etat where they just overtook the government and the president gone. And the whole thing was supported by the US military and the CIA, who did a lot of crazy things throughout the whole thing. But basically, it went pretty deep. Like, Kennedy was expressing concerns about removing Goulart from power since 1961. It's 3 years before the coup. And then, of course, Kennedy dealt with the whole Cuban Missile Crisis that kind of backfired. So there's a bit of pressure on him to, like, do well and fight communism. And then the CIA initiates a psychological warfare campaign against the people of Brazil, where they initiated street rallies and anti-Goulart sentiments, and they planted seeds in society to stir chaos and all these things. And then in 1963, Kennedy gave Goulart a choice: either remove anti-American politicians from power or face economic pressure from the US. And then Kennedy dies. You know, pew pew! And then he's replaced by Johnson, who has to deal with the actual coup that happened on March 31st of 1964, where the Brazilian military was approaching the capital to seize the government and all that. And when Johnson heard about it while he was on his ranch in Texas, he was like, activate Operation Brother Sam, which was a huge military operation to support the coup by providing them with resources and fuel and weapons and all these things, so they can seize the government and sustain power. And the coup was executed pretty flawlessly, and Brazil went into a military dictatorship until 1985. You're welcome. And yes, so did the US act in its own interest when it supported the coup? Well, yes they did. And you can see this pretty clearly in the US foreign policy, which is pretty summed up by the Kennedy Doctrine. Here's a quote from his inaugural address, where he basically warned that the United States would do anything and everything to assure the survival and the success of liberty, to make sure communism does not thrive and exist, because that's anti-liberty, allegedly. Because, like, during this whole Cold War era, there's such a paranoid culture about communism bad. There's such a polarization between communism and capitalism. Is like, we must win. It's a whole thing, because Spider-Man is communist and wait, what? Anyway, it was all about keeping communism out of the Western Hemisphere, out of Brazil, out of Cuba, out of the United States, because communism bad. Of course, there were more specifics to the reasons they actually supported the coup than just fighting communism. You also have to understand that this was a competitive time between the US and the Soviet Union. A lot of investments were going into the space race and Vietnam. Like, the US really wanted to win and all those things. And when it came to Brazil, by just helping them do the coup d'etat because of not wanting it to be communist and not prioritizing Brazilians, like, it went into a military dictatorship for 20 years. How is that much better? Like, a bunch of people just disappeared. A bunch were tortured and imprisoned. Tortured by the military, who was taught by the CIA. And you know what the CIA called it? Scientific methods by which to obtain the truth. Like, oh my gosh. Torture is a science, according to the CIA. And of course, there was an economic incentive for them to support the coup d'etat, like Brazil people, the Amazon rainforest. Resources! So that was the whole thing. Like, by 1971, a lot of the privately owned companies were foreign owned. That doesn't mean they're owned by the US, but they certainly weren't owned by Brazilians, and it wasn't advancing their own economy and society. You know? Like, think about this. There's the coup of '64. They supported it because of their foreign policy and their resources. Helping Brazil was not in the picture. It's not touching any of this. It's not involved. It's just not there. Helping Brazil, I want to help a Brazilian? No. I want to fight communism. I want to gain resources. No. Anyway, This is a little enlightenment into Cold War event at the time. This is just one of the many clandestine operations that happened. You hear me? It was crazy. It was a time period. Anyway, here's some well-frozen Cold War memes fresh out of the freezer because war is cold. Because really, it really was just Brazil was just trying to exist and USA was just like, no. Anyway, since it's the end of the year, I wanted to express my frustration about when Bozy says, so what? Like literally, so what? I'm like, I said the answer. What more do you want from me? And then he says the answer. And it's like, we said that. We said that. But we didn't say it the very specific way that you wanted us to say it. Like, what do you want from us? What do you want? But then again, he was kind of right, like, getting us to speak and what.